So hello, my name is Dustin Mark. I'm one of the emergency physicians here in Kaiser Oakland, and I'm going to be talking about the difficult airway cart today and its organization, the thought process behind the organization, and the contents. So to back up a bit, the real reason to have a difficult airway cart is because when you are in a situation where traditional direct laryngoscopy is not successful, often there is a time crunch to secure a backup method of ventilation and oxygenation. And having your equipment centralized and readily available is a key component of meeting that time mark. So in that spirit, we've tried to centralize all our supplies in one cart, such that the operators, be it emergency or anesthesia, have ready access to all the usual implements that they would use in an algorithmic approach to a difficult airway. And in fact, the first drawer here deals with the situation where you've predicted that the person has a difficult airway even prior to attempting laryngoscopy or inducing a state of paralysis or sedation. And in that scenario, oftentimes, if you have the luxury of time, the best approach would be an awake approach. So in the top drawer here, we've kind of outlined what you want to have in those situations where you might take a bronchoscopic approach, for example, a fiber optic bronchoscope, either through the nose or through the mouth, in order to secure an airway without arresting breathing in a patient. A key component of doing that is to have an endotracheal tube that's pliable enough and soft enough to actually accommodate the bronch and make the tight turns, for example, through the nose. And those are the endotracheal tubes that we have up here at the top. The other nice thing about an endotracheal tube, besides it being very soft and pliable, is it has a little ring on it, which allows you to direct the tip. It has basically a string attached to a ring. The string goes all the way down to the end tip of the endotracheal tube. You can pull the ring and actually direct the tube downwards. So as you might be approaching the nose this way, and you've got to make that turn around the pharynx, you can actually pull the ring and make the angle more acute. And likewise, when you get into the larynx and you have to approach an anterior airway, which is often one of the situations where we predict a difficult airway where somebody doesn't have a lot of depth here from their chin to their hyoid bone, and you have to make sure that that tip can go very anterior. That ring can really help you out quite a bit. So you can do it blind, which is not optimal, but that would help you do it blind. But ideally, when you have put this tube in, you have a camera through it, and you find that you need to get your tip a little more anterior towards the glottic inlet where the vocal cords are, you can pull that ring. The tube's soft enough to accommodate that. So the three sizes here are 6.0, 7.0, and 8.0, just to accommodate different sizes of folks. Alongside the endotracheal tubes as well, the other thing that we have in here to allow you one more time when you're using a bronchoscope is called an entry catheter. What the entry catheter does is it's basically a long tube for oxygen. And the way that you get this tube for oxygen into the lungs is you would put this like a sleeve over a pediatric bronchoscope. It would not fit an adult bronchoscope. The lumen's not big enough for the traditional adult bronchoscope. But for a PD bronchoscope, which is really what we preferentially would often try to use, just because it's a smaller diameter and a little easier to manipulate, this will work well. And if you do find that, for example, you can't get the tube in or whatnot, you can't advance the endotracheal tube because of size disproportions, or the nose isn't working out, or whatever, you could always advance the bronchoscope into the lungs and slide this catheter off, ventilate through this little adapter here through oxygen. You can use an ambu bag. Actually, it hooks up just like you would for a endotracheal tube. At the end there's an adapter, and squeeze oxygen in while you're trying to figure out a backup plan. So that's kind of the two main implements we have for an awake approach, to have those two backup options ready. Now, going through what happens in the other side of the algorithm, if you were to start with an awake approach being a divergent pathway until I haven't initiated RSI yet, that would be kind of your top drawer, and the entry could live up there as well. When you visualize an algorithm, oftentimes there's a breaking point where you've induced paralysis, you've initiated RSI, rapid sequence induction or intubation. But the induction part's really what I'm talking about, where you've pushed a paralytic. Once you're below that line, your options diverge a little bit, and the urgency becomes very much greater. So that's really where the rest of the cart comes into play. So you've got a paralyzed patient that you can't get a tube into, and perhaps you can't even bag mask ventilate. And that's where the next drawer comes into place, where you have a can't intubate, can't ventilate with a bag mask valve. The next step in your armamentarium should be an LMA. And what an LMA does is it kind of bypasses the usual barriers to ventilation there, being large tongues, redundant airway, just physical blockage of the airway by putting an actual buttress in, slides along the tongue, gets into the hypopharynx. Everyone should be trained in how to do these. They're great rescue airways. They're sized based on the size of the patient, so you can see there's a weight marker here that tells you how big the patient should be to accommodate the size. So this is 70 to 100 kilos, which is the largest size we have. And it goes all the way down to a 2.5 size, which is 30 to 50 kilos. So large adult or small adult or large child. The other nice thing about these particular LMAs, which are called air cues, is that as opposed to a traditional LMA, they don't have any blockage of the actual outlet there that leads down and go that you would normally ventilate through. The reason being that that's important is that you can then pass tubes through here, or an entry catheter that I showed you earlier. Once you have the LMA in, you can use this as a conduit to actually get a more secure tube in. Remember, this actually is a supraglottic airway, meaning that it sits above the glottis. It doesn't go into the trachea, and so it's not technically a secure airway because, well, vomit could still leak around it. You can't get a tight seal. You wouldn't be able to provide high levels of airway pressures or high PEEP for a hypoxic patient, etc. So this is still kind of a temporizing thing, but it definitely would serve the same purposes as a bag mask ventilation, and also easier to do it because you don't have to have a tight seal on the face, and it's a good rescue method if you're having trouble getting a tight seal for various reasons, be it a beard or somebody has a small face or whatever the case may be. So those are key, and that's why they're kind of the second drawer here, is that when you're really up against the wall and you've tried to intubate somebody, you can't bag mask valve ventilate them, you should grab the LMA as your first thing. Also up here will be the case where you can ventilate somebody with a bag mask valve, but the intubator's having trouble actually passing the tube or can't see it well. Often the next step that we'll use in that type of scenario where you've missed a couple times would be using a bougie. And a bougie has a caudate tip on it, just like the catheter, where it's got a little inflection forward. That's a little rigid there. The idea here is that you use this as a stylet or a guide wire of sorts. And being that smaller than an endotracheal tube, oftentimes if you have some glottic narrowing or subglottic stenosis or whatever the case may be that you can't get the tube in, you can pass this into the glottis. You can feel the tip click along the tracheal rings, which gives you some verification. And oftentimes people will push this in until they get a firm stop at the carina, as opposed to going in the esophagus where there would be no firm stop and just keep going to the stomach. And then you can use basically a Selger technique like you would with a central line and use this to then pass an endotracheal tube right over. So this is a great first backup option, and often the first thing we'll go to when somebody's having trouble either locating the glottis or passing the actual physical tube in. But in order to do that, usually you've already had to ventilate them a little bit. So if you can't bag mask ventilate, grab the LMA first. You can pass the bougie through the LMA, right, blindly, or you can use the bronchoscope. So you have a lot of options and time once the LMA is in, not necessarily needed if you can bag mask ventilate the person safely. It's just more of a cannot ventilate, cannot intubate situation. Now sometimes the LMA is not really an option because there's just gross contamination of the airway. The person's vomited, there's blood everywhere. Whatever the case may be, since that's not a secure airway, it doesn't protect loose material from falling into the airway. If you were to put an LMA into somebody that's actively vomiting or actively bleeding, you're just going to push blood into their airway, so that's not a good option. In those cases, if you can't get in directly with your endotracheal tube or with your bougie, really the only option left, because ventilation without a secure tracheal tube isn't a great option, would be a surgical airway. So that's the third drawer here. And what we have in here is a couple different setups. The main one that we want to use, especially for adults, is the emergency cook kit. All right, this is a universal kit, and I'm not going to open this up here, but what it has inside of it is both a Seldinger pathway, this is Seldinger here, and a surgical pathway on this side. And the Seldinger pathway is a percutaneous approach where you would put in a catheter over a needle, where you would aspirate into the trachea through the cricothyroid membrane, pass your catheter in, put a wire in, take the catheter out, leave the wire in, and dilate up just like you would for a central line. It's a little more time consuming though, so it's there for more of an elective kind of situation where you're not really in a crash situation where you need to get an airway quickly. More oftentimes, if we're really pouring this out, we're going to go down the surgical pathway, which is a scalpel and a tracheal hook and the actual cricothyrotomy tube, which is key there. One thing that often goes along with this, one technique that we've been trained to that helps a lot when doing the open airway is that once you incise through the cricothyroid membrane and make the hole, you can actually use your bougie to secure your place in there. Because one of the dangers of doing the surgical technique is that if you don't have a very secure, clean way into the trachea, if you have an obese neck or whatnot, sometimes you can end up putting your tube into the pretracheal space and creating a false lumen. And then you're not ventilating the patient, you're just creating a lot of mediastinal air and trauma, and that does happen. So one way around that is that once you make your cut and you pull up with your tracheal hook, you can pass the bougie in, and then your bougie secures your passageway. You can feel the tracheal rings, you can feel more secure that you're in the right space, and then just pass your cric tube right over the bougie. So we'll also use these two things together. But for now they remain in separate drawers just because algorithmically the way the bougie usually comes into play is without the cric kit. As well as the universal cric kit in here, because this is meant to be a combined difficult airway cart for pediatrics and adults. There's a very much smaller kit called the PercTrach, and this is for the pediatrics population. The reason we kept this is because the universal kit has a 5 millimeter inner diameter cric tube. It's about 6 or 7 external diameter, but you can imagine that can be limiting in smaller children. So there's a size cutoff for cricothyrotomies in children in general, but there's definitely a child size that would be too small for the 5 millimeter kit. Would need something just a little bit smaller. So this has a 4 millimeter interior diameter kit. And the way the PercTrach works is it's kind of it's a percutaneous approach as opposed to a surgical approach, where you would use a needle, you put the needle in, and then you have a little dilator and guide wire combination that goes in. The needle is a breakaway needle, so you squeeze these two green ends together, the needle breaks in half as you're putting your dilator and guide wire into the trachea. And then you take the guide wire, you take the dilator out, you leave the guide wire in there, and pass your little tiny trach tube in. Okay, so you can see it's hard to totally see it, but there's a wire and there's a little tiny tube in there top there. So it's actually pretty quick though to use this. The problem is that they're a little old and you can't get great visualization as you will with the surgical technique. So we do prefer the open technique if we can with a blade, just so you can really see your anatomy better than doing percutaneous in an adult often. Also in here are just some a la carte things, a tracheal hook, which is in the emergency cricothyrotomy catheter set, but just in case you need extra ones or someone drops it on the floor or something like that, it's always a good idea to have that. And this is called a trousseau dilator, which will open up the tracheal inlet. Sometimes if the tissues collapse or whatnot, and you've got the hook in there and you can't see where you're going, you can stick this in to your surgical site and open up the tissues by squeezing it. And it's got a lever here, and then these distal prongs open up, so you can spread open your field and see what you're doing. That's the main stuff in here. There's some extra scalpels and an extra larger trach tube, which doesn't really have a role in a cricothyrotomy, but if we were having to do an open tracheostomy for some reason, if the person had a little scar tissue too high up and you had to go lower, then you might want a bigger tube. But that's not going to come into play very often. Next drawer down, I put in here for kind of, you still need a surgical airway, but you can't use any of these things, either because there's altered neck anatomy, you can't cut in there, they have a big goiter, or they're a small kid. So something is precluding the use of a cricothyrotomy approach and making a big incision, and you're nervous about it. The other option would be to do a transtracheal jet airway. And what you're doing there basically is you're going to use a 14 gauge catheter as your airway instead of a full cricothyrotomy airway. It's kind of similar to the beginning of the cricothyrotomy Seldinger approach, because you're putting a catheter in, but you stop at that point. You want something large enough that you can actually pass oxygen through, so that's why we have these 14 gauge guys in there. They're 2.5 or 2 inches long. Really, this comes up in the pediatric population that's more or less under 10 to 12, where the traditional teaching is that cricothyrotomy is not indicated, but really the problem is that they are too small for the tubes that we have available. So you're really on a good option in a surgical airway scenario there is to use a smaller tube, i.e. a 14 gauge catheter. And once you get that in, you're going to hook it up to this flow modulator, the E&K flow modulator. And what this is a very long tube that hooks up directly to your wall oxygen. They have another catheter in here as well, a 601, but we put the 14 gauges in, also in part because they're a little longer, and in part because sometimes this can be just a little thick, especially for the very small kids. We're talking like under 5. And so the sizing isn't going to make a big difference in the majority of cases, but sometimes this is a little too big, or you need something a little longer in an adult situation. So we have these things as backups, but technically you could just take this out and use this in most cases. Take this out, put your syringe on here, enter in, slide your catheter over as you get air bubbles, and then you're going to hook it directly up to this port here, okay, at the end, and it's got a flexible tubing on it, so you don't have a rigid attachment to your catheter. And the way this works is that you actually control the flow with your finger here. There's a few holes that come off here, and oxygen's flowing pretty fast. Usually hook it directly up to the full wall source. But in this case, since we don't really have that luxury, you just hook it up to the Christmas tree adapter and turn up this 5 part as high as you can. And you will breathe for them in a 3 on rhythm, 3 to 1 rhythm. So you would be like the blast is 1 second long, and you take 3 seconds to let them ventilate off. You don't need that much time with oxygen going in, but you need time to let the CO2 come out. So you want to have, like you would normally with respirations, that the inspiratory phase time is the shorter part of it is about 1/3 of the time of the expiratory phase. So you're like 1, 1, 2, 3, 1, 1, 2, 3, and then you end up doing that about 20 to 30 times a minute. And that should be providing enough oxygen to keep their lungs, fairly well oxygenated, their body very well oxygenated. It's not going to do great things for the ventilation, unfortunately, but this is generally just a temporizing measure until you can figure something else out. I will say though, sometimes they will do an entire OR case, like an ENT type case with this type of setup, and you can successfully ventilate people. It's just challenging. Not ideal, and I will admit that I've never actually done that. It's all theoretical, but the theory is just get the oxygen in and keep them oxygenated that way. This is just a tracheostomy kit in here, and just some other implements, as well as the McGill forceps, which used to live up here and now came down here. These would be used to help you with your awake airway, passing the tube in, removing foreign bodies, etc. They happen to be down here just because they're kind of like placed on the side currently. And finally, this isn't really part of a difficult airway setup. This is where we're keeping supplies for the glide scope, which some people will use as their first line laryngoscopy. So you might make an argument this is a difficult airway implement because people might use it after using a traditional laryngoscopic approach with just the straight blade light source, but some people will just use this as their standard airway equipment. So it doesn't really fit into the algorithm so much so, because this is really becoming more of a standard of care thing here, and you might use that first, find out you can intubate, and then go down the algorithm. But just so you know that they're here, and that way the PD size is here as well. The pediatric sized glidoscopes go from 1 to 2, and the adults are 3 and 4. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 sizes in here. The pediatric glide scope connection is in here because it takes a different size camera that has to go in with the pediatric size blades. So you can see that they are color coded. You've got the little light baby blue part and light baby blue handle there for the PD glide scope stuff. They also have a special stylet in here because the other thing you need to know about glide scopes is that because of their strange acute curvature here, they need a special curve to the stylet blade, and so they have some prefabricated ones that go along with them. So all the PD ones are contained in here. The adult ones are a la carte on the side here, and you can see how sharp that curve is all the way down. And so these, need to, if you're doing a glide scope approach, you have to make sure that you get the stylets out too. It's not your traditional stylet. You will never be able to get the tube in otherwise. You can't get it in without a stylet just because of the strange curve it is. The other parts, the adult wires and everything are actually on the glide scope cart, which sits as a separate tower that has the video monitor on it, and the adult cables are already hooked up to there. So technically, this is all backup supplies and part of the rounding out the pediatric difficult airway part of this. The actual glide scope tower, most of the adult stuff is in a separate location just because it tends to be used as a first line of command for a lot of people. So that rounds out the overview of the difficult airway card. I hope that made sense to everybody. And feel free to grab me if you have any questions or suggestions on how we can make it better. Thank you.